There we go. Okay, let's see. Check one. Okay, so we're going to get started here in Belfast in just a few minutes. Just stand by, and thank you so much for dialing in. Great. Okay. Okay, so we're in Belfast, and it's a bit bizarre to speak to two audiences at once. Like, hello, Alfie and Helen and Rocky and Barry and so on. Helen's friend. Your name again? Enrica. Manuel's here from Canada, and Maria's helping out. Thank you, Maria. And I'd like to welcome all of you watching online to the GCAS Symposium, which features Olthuis Gordon and Todd McGowan, Jim Olthuis, who will be joining us remotely, as well as folks here in Belfast, which is going to be exciting. And basically, we're here in Belfast primarily because Pete Rollins, some of you may know him, does wake festivals here. And wake festivals are basically folks getting together to talk about issues of meaning and desire, temptation. Okay, enough of that. In Belfast, and he was like, hey, Creston, he called me up like in Christmas time. He says, hey, why don't you come to Belfast? And I was like, okay, we can do that. So here we're having a symposium today. And then also we're having two seminars. Barry started his seminar this morning, and Jameson Webster's seminar will start tomorrow afternoon. And then Rocky is going to do something on, you're talking about Agamben today. And Rocky literally just flew in. He hasn't slept since Boston. He hasn't slept. He tried to sleep, but he was dreaming of Godzilla and Thor. Conan. Oh, sorry. Right. So we're getting to know folks here in Belfast. It's the first time I've been here. first time Manuel's been here, who flew in from Canada. Maria and I took the train up from Dublin yesterday. So it's a beautiful city. Yeah. Okay, well, we'll get started. Basically, the symposium deals with ideas of desire, lack, and the relationship between desiring and lacking, and how those two are juxtaposed and maybe intertwined together. And so we're excited about this symposium today. And without further ado, let me just see if Lewis has joined us online. He's been having connectivity issues. So, okay, let me just check. No. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to come back on, hello, and introduce an incredible thinker, a wonderful mind, and also someone who has joined up with GCAS and does many other things beside, including award-winning filmmaker here in Belfast. Has done some films, actually was in England. Didn't she come visit you, Alfie?
Yeah. She talked at my college last week.
How did that go?
We screened the film.
Okay, yeah, and they screened a film at Alfie's University in England last week. The film was called Making Love, and it's like a incredible interrogation in relationship between desire, not just love between man and woman, although it is that, but also about the gaze, what the gaze does. Helen Rollins graduated from Cambridge University, top in her class. She speaks multiple languages, so on many podcasts. It seems like you keep doing more and more. People are asking you to jump in and do this, but it's really amazing I've actually just met Helen for the first time, even though we've been working together for a couple of years. So, yeah, so I'd like to introduce Helen, who will give you the title of her talk, because I can't remember it. And then she'll give us her talk about film and ideology and desire and so on. So let's put that on.
Okay,
here.
great. Cheers.
Yeah. Cheers.
So, hello, everybody out there. Hello, people here. So the title is, I wanted to give Creston something snazzy, and probably is too much snazziness and not much content, but it's Avoiding the Void, which sounds I always have this thing about how anything that sounds really poetic or feel good often is really ideological. You know, you have a lot of ideas that get developed that are a part of this sort of ideological supplement that gets developed, you know, to cover over what's really going on in terms of the market system. And often it's like academicized terms or like poetic sounding terms or, you know, metaphor or whatever. So I don't want to contribute to that. But what I was trying to get at is that film, and hopefully I'll talk about it in the next sort of 20 minutes or so, is a medium, an artistic medium that is particularly good at ideology critique, at getting us to confront the divided nature of desire. But unfortunately, because of the way that the entertainment industry so-called, is, I don't know, there's no mind behind it, but it has developed, and the kind of content that gets made and the way things are financed, often, very unfortunately, the void, as in something that is a positive thing to encounter in terms of how desire and fantasy functions, in terms of liberating us from the toxic pursuit of basically the ideology of promise, that the film is, by its very structure, so brilliant at getting us to confront this. But the way that it has developed in terms of being captured by monopoly capitalism, we kind of get something that is a tired, rubbish, sort of shadow of what it could be in terms of its political and emancipatory potential. So I wanted to start off with a little anecdote about a friend that I met a few years ago, and we're still friends, perhaps surprisingly. But in our first meeting, we got talking about Freud, and I don't know how this came up because he didn't know that I was into Freud at all. And he was went on a bit of a rant about how terrible Freud is, because Freud is this sort of patriarchal figure. You go to psychoanalysis and it's really terrible because you have some man sitting there telling you how to think and how to desire and, you know, what's wrong with you. And this sort of misinterpretation of Freud, I thought, was just so telling in terms of the age that we're in, because actually Freud's work and the work of psychoanalysis is the precise opposite. We go into psychoanalysis believing that there is this person, this all-knowing person through transference, we project onto the analyst that this person knows us, can help us, will guide us, will tell us what we think and what we desire. But actually kind of the opposite is true. And we gradually are let down, realizing that this person, this godlike figure that we have imagined, which is part of, it's necessary for us to go in and ideologically kind of project this onto this figure, actually just lets us down very gradually to reality. And we discover that the other knows nothing too. There is no undivided God out there. And film is like this. Film works in a similar way to the best of psychoanalysis. So film leads us by desire. It's this very riven art form. We have the sound design, the music, the acting. We're taken along also by a narrative form that's developed, through Hollywood and elsewhere, which is this narrative form. And to in a certain extent, I think fiction novels do this as well. And the best sort of fiction novels, they lead us by desire. We go in, we engage libidinally with the main character or main characters, and we go after their goal. And this is an opportunity, I argue, to get us to really confront ideology and desire in its division, in the way that psychoanalysis operates. And I would argue that it's unlike any other art form in existence in that way. Art, I think the best of art, precisely that which speaks to us, that stands the test of time, is that which tarries with contradiction rather than papering over contradiction. I would argue that art that papers over contradiction is ideological art, is propaganda. But film in particular has the capacity within its form to get us to confront this contradiction. But unfortunately, because film is so expensive to make, and because of the way that corporate media has developed in this era of kind of monopoly capitalism with, what do you call it? Capital mobility and things like this, where effectively we have states now that are subservient to capital, to these corporations. It is in the best interest, quote unquote, but obviously worst interest eventually, of these corporate media to produce content that is not emancipatory, that doesn't do the true work of film, in order to sustain this toxic system, which in order to function, must fail. I always use the example of aspirin. Whenever I have a headache, I take an aspirin, and a packet of aspirin in the UK costs like 20p. And it costs so little because it precisely works. Our friend, I think a few of us know Nina Power, her dad. So I'm sorry, Nina, I'm stealing your anecdote, but it's a really good anecdote. Her dad was a dentist. And when he completed his career as a dentist and he sold his practice was valued at £2,000 because he was such an effective dentist that all the people in his community had such good teeth that there wasn't a problem to solve. So it was valued at so little. So capitalism has to fail to function. But unfortunately, this is not good for us. This is not good for the planet. This is not even good for capitalism. At a certain point, there have to be these adjustments. And, we've gone through 14 years of stagnation or recession, precisely because we are engaged in this ideological dimension of reality of capitalism and haven't got to the core of understanding what is toxic precisely about capitalism. And it's all very well for us to discuss at a sort of a conscious level about obviously surplus value. I mean, I'll come on to this in a second, but what is so difficult about confronting capitalism is the ideological dimension, the ideology of promise. And I'll talk about why it's so difficult now to get ahead of. And I also argue, and this is from my friend Carlos, a psychoanalyst in New York, he says that it's not about consciousness raising, so when we have politics at the level of discourse, we talk about consciousness raising. What film is so good at is unconsciousness raising. And really, Todd McGowan has written so much about this, and he's going to be talking later about the ideological dimension, the libidinal dimension of capitalism, which I don't think, and many don't think, we have really got a handle on. And film is so good at getting us to confront. So as humans, we are born twice. We are born too early. We are materially born into the world, when we are actually our date of birth, and then we are born into language. So when we are born into language, we are born too soon. Other animals, like an elephant, is born and runs on the plains of wherever they're born in Africa. But human beings are born too soon. We have big heads. Our mothers have small pelvises. We're born too soon, and we are like fetuses attached to our mother for a certain period of time. Gradually, we come to separate, but this separation, and And in this separation, there is a frustration. This is how language develops. I mean, this is a really long thing that I won't get into, but I just wanted to touch on the point that in our separation, we, before we were conscious, we were part of our mothers. You know, we were fed, you're tired, here's some food, you know, here is your bed, you're crying, let me comfort you. We were attached to our mothers and we didn't have to think or feel, or we couldn't, because obviously we can't really think until we have language, and language only develops out of frustration. So we're kind of in this, we come from less than nothing, essentially. But when we are born, we have this sense that there was once a point in time where we had something. And like the Adam and Eve leaving the Garden of Eden, Eden becomes a utopia only insofar as it was lost. So we are constantly marked, because of the nature of our birth and our development into language and the development of subjectivity only developing because we are born too soon and then through separation. We are marked by this sense of loss, of lack. But the lack, it was never really anything. We didn't experience our mothers before we spoke, but we have this feeling of lack, that we once had something. And that feeling of lack that we explicate through utopianism, you know, we believe that if only we still had it, our lives would be whole and complete. And this is, again, is the idea of the story of the Garden of Eden, that it was only Eden insofar as it was lost. So capitalism hooks us by our desire, running on this belief in wholeness and completeness. We're marked by lack. We believe that there is something out there, some object often, or some pursuit or some person. You know, I think capitalism is not just about the products we buy, but the whole way that we desire. So we believe that there is another out there who, or an object or a thing that will give us this totalitarian oneness, this perfection. But it's a lie, it doesn't exist. That utopian belief only exists insofar as we come from less than nothing. But that utopian belief is what sustains the toxicity of the death drive of market capitalism. Because when we believe in a transcendent other object or being or thing that can give us this utopian experience that we never had, because logically it cannot exist, we have to sustain the utopian fantasy by shooting ourselves in the foot or creating enemies behind whom, these contingent enemies behind whom we would have this utopian oneness if only they didn't exist. So utopia exists in their shadow. And obviously this is a huge dynamic in the logic of fascism, of Nazism, of Hitler. And obviously there's an argument that fascism is a dialectical dimension of liberalism itself. So, you know, we often talk about how we're in a world of solipsism, of black and white thinking, of concrete thinking, of enemy making, which is absolutely true, and that we need to bring back nuance. You often hear, actually from conservative thinkers today, you know, bring back nuance, bring back discussion, bring back debate, which is all well and good. And I think, you know, we absolutely do need to bring back nuance. But unfortunately, you can't just logically bring back nuance if you do not understand nuance at the level of desire. Because our black and white thinking is sustained by this dialectic of believing in utopian oneness. So what I think film does in particular is it has this capacity to bring back nuance at the level of fantasy, which is that which we believe to be whole and complete, to be perfect, just like psychoanalysis. And this is why psychoanalysis is so good at ideology critique and at the critique of capitalism. But obviously there's issues related to how psychoanalysis fits into capitalism, who can afford to do psychoanalysis. And I'll come on to why I think psychoanalysis is so good at ideology critique in a second. But it gets us to confront the lack within our desire. Once we can confront the lack within our desire, the lack within God, that God is actually divided, or that God is potentially lack itself, then we don't have the motivation or the need to sustain toxic, black and white, concrete thinking, enemy making. And sometimes I think where the conservative position gets it wrong is that sometimes the correct thing is to think in a black and white way. You know, sometimes things are really shit and there are people doing bad things and you do need to stand up for certain things. But it's only when we really understand how fantasy operates and how we are captured in a toxic way by fantasy. There is a positive dimension to fantasy, which I'll also come on to in a second. And I think it's what makes life worth living. But it is this like kryptonite that we have to deal with. It can be the worst of everything and the best of everything. But yes, so it really helps us engage in sort of a discernment of when we need to act. And Zizek obviously talks about don't act, just think. And I think what he's talking about is the Hegelian thought related to desire, related to fantasy, that can help us once we come to terms through reason. You can't just think your way to the cure, and psychoanalysis is something you have to experientially do, which is why I also think film is so good, because it really does. It is an experience rather than a logical process. But we can come to understand that God is divided, and therefore we do not need to sustain this black and white enemy making. And sometimes this liberation, quote unquote, this emancipatory confrontation with the gaze of lack, we can then discern in our reality what is the right thing to do. Obviously, there's a famous passage from Marx in the introduction to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, where he talks about the living flower. And I think this is really what he's getting at. This is where he's proto-Freudian. He talks about the opium that distracts us from our chains. And, if we can get off the opium, we can confront our chains, unpick the chains and pick the living flower. And I think psychoanalysis, it's not like there's a magical solution on the other side of psychoanalysis, but we can pick the living flower. And I think ordinary unhappiness ties us to this idea of picking the living flower. Psychoanalysis, unfortunately, doesn't make everything okay. It gets us to be okay with the fact that things aren't okay. And in that, okayness, in this ability to tolerate the world in its dialectical ordinariness, in its contradiction, in the fact that the lack and contradiction is positive precisely, it's because it's from whence we came. We would not exist without lack, that we are able to tolerate reality and meet it where it's at, and potentially then, because capitalism always comes with these new ideas, these new things that seem on an aesthetic level to be emancipatory, but they are actually just a way to do more and more and more exploitation. And we are always convinced that we have something new constantly, but we are living through sort of a fourth industrial revolution. Previous industrial revolutions, the same thing happened. You had the robber barons in the end of the 19th century in the US, and always ending up in a monopoly because this time it's different. This time, corporate media deserves subsidies paid for by the government, in this sort of, we have this weird version of state-sponsored trickle-down economics, which is amazing, but it's through this ideology of promise that this time it's different, tech's different, it's all different. This is that and often through the aesthetics of the left, we get caught up in something, we repress the contradiction of capitalism, the appropriation of surplus value by those who own the means of production, through these very comforting, heartwarming, often progressivist cover stories for what's really going on. So to go back to what fantasy is and how, unfortunately, it's not so easy, right? Because we can't just do away with fantasy. Our lives would be shit. We'd be depressed. We'd be melancholic. We have to have this dimension. We are burdened with this dimension, but it actually makes life worth living. And Lacan obviously tells us, do not give way in terms of your desire. So in terms of, I always think about this like a crossroads at in a car. You have the yield sign, give way, céder in French, yield. So when you're in your car, it's do not yield. So do not give yourself over, in a sense. If you yield, you're giving yourself over to your desire, because desire will be manifested when you achieve it as something that's impotent, and you'll be depressed, because the fantasy ends when you realize that there's this, you can never be soothed of your lack in the object that you pursue. But at the same time, in terms again of this crossroads, do not yield. And in terms of traffic, when we say yield, we mean give way, as in let it pass you by. And don't, that is not that stoic solution of just I'm above desire, I know it's a lie and it's not worth it. That is also a dead end. And what I would argue that film does so well is it leads us by desire, which is what we get meaning in our existence from, in order to confront us with the dialectical nature of desire. Obviously, ideological film tells us, it was a happy ending, they ran away together, and it was all perfect. And this obviously makes us more and more dissatisfied, because our reality, because precisely it is divided, and because of the dialectical logic of fantasy, we are constantly let down. And it's depressing, Obviously, there's times when we need a crutch, and we go have a bad day, and we might watch a rom-com and get that good, heartwarming feeling. But unfortunately, what has happened is that what I think is the best of film, which is not necessarily, we have art house film that may be a bit more experimental, that doesn't use narrative in the same way, it's a bit more poetic. I think there's a time and a place for that. But I think really the powerful film is that which operates a lot like mainstream cinema, but that allows contradiction to inhabit it. Contradiction exists in everything, rocks, and we have, an example of contradiction in the natural universe is Darwin, evolution, collapsing into something new, everything is marked by contradiction. So contradiction has to go somewhere. And when we build this edifice of film that is really ideological, I think it really can sit badly, and we can feel annoyed with it. And sometimes we look at, on these streaming services, and there's so many films, it's like water everywhere and not a drop to drink. Like, we're not getting really what art is designed for. And I think what film is so good at, and I think this is to do a lot with the way that film's financed, and the way with that the aesthetics of the left through corporate subsidies, which is like highly reactionary right-wing neoliberalism, these solutions to sustain the problem of corporate media not making enough money precisely because people don't want to watch the films. These new solutions, which seem so great because we have these governing bodies, state-run, state funding, oh, how fantastic. But actually, this is an even more egregious form of capitalism. So, yeah, I think that unfortunately, what is so frustrating is we aren't making the most of what is so powerful in film. And because, as I've explained, profit is only sustained by failure. But eventually, the failure will catch up with us entirely. If we don't have enough equality, the whole system will completely collapse. And film offers us this emancipatory potential to get us to the point of confronting the gaze of black, precisely so that we can come to, in a way that's beyond reason. This is a level more unconscious. And, in this time of immense culture wars, of enemy making, of an inability to really do anything political. Politics is the towering of contradiction. As soon as you have more than two people in a group, desires confront, and the way that something is managed must involve this confrontation of contradictory desires. And what we have often in politics now is a shimmer of politics, is it's something apolitical. It's, you must think this way, you must think that way. We can't listen to this group, we can't listen to that group. And we're avoiding doing the political thing, which is really where picking the living flower exists, engaging with reality as it is, instead of how we hope it to be. And when we hope it to be a certain way, with the projection of this futurality that we know where we're going, we do end up developing scapegoats who carry the lack in our projected fantasy, because there is no knowing where we are going, and there is no utopia on the other side of fantasy. And these enemies, these scapegoats, sustain that fantasy in their existence by casting a shadow. So yeah, I think that we're missing a trick in film. And often, if you're making film that does this, even though, if you look back at so many of the great films, obviously a really famous one that does this so well is The Wizard of Oz. These characters go on a journey and they're confronted with the lack in their fantasy, with the wizard who is nothing but a man behind a curtain. We do get great examples of films that do come out. I mean, I've seen, 2017 was a fantastic year. Unfortunately, I didn't think there had been that many great years since then. But I think we are missing a trick, and often it can be difficult for filmmakers through the way films are financed, and the way, because it is such an unbalanced system. This is Hegel talks about this so much, the master-slave dialectic, but when you exclude a voice, you must, and your sort of power system is so unbalanced, you require a sort of bullying tactic to keep down the voice of, or you have to cast the other who provides an external vision that doesn't match your own vision of the system you're running. And you must cast these others as less than human. Because the humans are always divided, and if you project them either as angels or demons, they are not human. They do not have a human voice to be able to confront what's really going on. And so often what happens is people are bullied out or forced to conform in a certain way. And obviously there's very many economic pressures which lead people to adopting an ideology and leaving the emancipatory dimension in their work in favor of a paycheck, which we all have to do sometimes, which is very unfortunate. But I think creating spaces within film is so good at this, can help us lower the stakes on a toxic pursuit of the ideology of promise and help us in the real world pick the living flower. So. Can I go?
No, just a couple questions.
Okay.
Do you mind?
No, go for it. Go for it.
So somebody just asked, and did you have these theories in mind when you first became a filmmaker?
No. Well, I was very into Lacan.
Repeat the question. So
the question was, did I have these theories in mind when I first became a filmmaker? I would say, I said no immediately. I say yes and no. I think that I was doing it in my films, because Alfie, you saw like my first film the other day, and actually it does the same thing and I didn't realize I was doing it. But I think through the frustration of making films in a certain way, which seemed to me like what film was for, then it becomes a more conscious thing, but I mean, I guess I was saying to Henry earlier that like, I'm not a philosopher or anything like that, but it's just when you in this sort of very world of sort of concrete thinking and I was talking about the aestheticization of left-wing politics and stuff like that. When you kind of maybe have a little bit of a background in the original text, it's very frustrating. And I'm a little bit of a crusader. So when I see something that's not right, I'll just pipe up. So I think it's more that I was really into psychoanalysis through studying film. I was introduced to it like through film theory. And then I spent a year at a university in France, which is sort of, has a big kind of background in this kind of thought. And I kind of realized that the majority of what we're given in terms of film theory, especially, is precisely not, it's like gets it completely backwards. So then I found myself, well, I guess I'm going to have to say something. So yeah, it's only because nobody else is saying something that I feel like I have to say something.
Were you saying that when you made Jamaica, you weren't consciously thinking of like psychoanalytic ideas?
Well, I do think, I mean, I was really into Lacan at the time, but I wasn't thinking like, I added a Lacanian quote retrospectively.
Okay,
that's yes. That fitted.
And when you're saying that like it works kind of the wrong way around in criticism,
yeah.
You're saying that like basically the mistake people make is they think that psychoanalysis explains films, but really
yeah,
films can explain.
It's psychoanalysis. No, absolutely right. Yeah, because basically I think that there's this thing of like there's, I had a bit of a debate the other day about depth psychology versus what I think psychoanalysis is. And I think in psychoanalysis, it's all on the surface. It's like we have our answer, it's right in front of us, but we can't confront it. It's too painful to confront in a certain way. But I think in different understandings, which may be deviated from Freud, there's this, there's a hidden meaning that you can come to learn, and you can sort of sort your life out by, there's some inner essence. And so I think that a lot of film theory, well, a lot of it turned into sort of, instead of adopting the universalist dimensions in Lacan and Freud, I mean, obviously coming from Hegel is like dialectically universalist, it turns into this oppositional, it's like trapped in the level of the imaginary, where it's like about gender, all these things that are emergence of something universal, but aren't the end of the story. And obviously in the way that capitalism operates, it is more conducive to, so the dialectic between enemy making and fantasy is that if you have something opposite, you can sell something through fantasy, or you can sell something through opposition. And a lot of what has come out of psychoanalytic theory is very oppositional, which I don't think is the end game of psychoanalysis, really. And I think, yeah, you're absolutely right that psychoanalysis is, film is psychoanalytic, rather than we can like, do a depth psychology study of like, this means this and this means this, and who gives a stuff, yeah. Like, what was the filmmaker thinking, or what's the character like? Yeah.
There's a follow-up question here. Do you feel like your recent film Alone,
yeah,
develops these motifs, your idea of the lack of the gaze, through a journey?
Yeah.
do you feel like that's developing even more? And in other words, like, I'm kind of waxing a little bit. Sorry, taking a little liberty.
Yeah.
But does your practice of film making deepen and penetrate and maybe even sharpen what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Yeah.
Nice.
I don't really know. I mean, I don't know. Also, other things like I started doing a podcast a few years ago because a friend of mine and I kind of theorized that it's political to face your public and to just speak publicly, and we're in this like really solipsistic age, and it wasn't about like putting our opinions across, but really coming to understand what we thought in the presence of other people, because you really need this play of yourself and the divided subjectivity of the other to understand yourself. And I think doing that has also like brought to more, because there is a thing as well, and I know this is something that David Lynch is very much against, like explicating films, which I think, is fine. That's totally fine. But I actually think that explicating, it sits alongside, like, I don't even know what I'm talking about. Like, I don't have all the answers. And also, I think you have to be very unsure of your own work as film if you feel like you're going to be giving away all the answers. Like film, like any art, is like completely kaleidoscopic and infinite, and you're confronting the subjectivity of every viewer, and they're bringing their own thing projected to it. So, I mean, in a way, it doesn't matter what I think, but then I think to be all sort of like, oh, it's a magical thing, and if you explain it, you take away the magic. I think you don't have confidence in your own work, if you're afraid that you're going to give the game away, because there's no game to be given away. There's like an experience that's created related to subjectivity. But I could be wrong, and I'm also always like, why am I doing this? Why am I talking? Like,
wonderful. Great.
Cool.
Todd's joined us online, as has Jim Olthuis as well. So, does anyone here have a question you want to ask Helen before we move on? Anyone here? Okay. Well, Helen, thank you so much.
not at all.
And great. Super. And well, thank you, Helen. That's great. I'm always super impressed with the way you can like speak and, I don't know, work through these very complex theories in such lucid ways. Yeah. Well, anyway, it's a bit awkward, like this whole thing is a little awkward, right?
Yeah.
Like, where do you look? Actually, you did a good job of that. Like, there's the camera. And it's like, but there's people everywhere. But okay, so great. Well, I'm really pleased to introduce to us Jim Olthuis. Jim Olthuis he's a retired philosopher and psychoanalyst practicing in Toronto for 30, 40 years, a friend of mine, and he is a professor at the Center for Christian Studies in Toronto. And so it's really a pleasure. He's written many books, especially having to do with the theme of love, but not in the typical cliche sense, but by working with Anna Sands for many years, for decades, he's been able to sort of shape the risk of what that means in ways that are very profound and moving. But so I'm going to move over here and put Jim on and mute myself, and then Jim will present. So 1 second, thanks. This will be great to have somebody to help with this, but okay, so let's see. Jim, could you unmute yourself and join us?
There, is that good? Can you hear me?
Jim, we can hear you. Thank you so much.
am I allowed to see who's there? How does that work?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So it's complicated. Okay. One sec. Yes, Jim, give me a second. But first, let me try to pin. Okay. 1 second. Pin? How do I pin it? Okay. So Jim, can you hear me still?
I can still hear you, yes.
Okay. So here's the folks in this room.
Okay,
See everybody. Is that
Very-
okay?
that's
Great. So you are talking to somebody.
very good.
Okay. And yeah, so thank you so much, Jim. It's really good to see you. I hope you're doing well.
Well, I'm pleased to be able to speak, and I love Belfast. I spent about a week there a couple years ago, and I loved it. So anyway, should I start?
Yes, please do. Thank you so much. Jim.
Okay. The big question that usually people talk about is to be or not to be. That's the question. My claim this morning is that to be or not to be is not a very good question. The real question, and that's my message, is to love or not to love. Why to be or not to be is prejudicial in a negative way is because of the way being has been defined. Being has been defined as power. And this goes all the way back to Plato. Let me quote Plato in the Sophist. My notion would be that anything which possesses any sort of power to affect another or to be affected by another, if only for a single moment, however trifling the cause and however slight the effect, has real existence. And I hold that the definition of being is simply power. Years later, Spinoza, in his Ethics, said this: everything, insofar as it is in itself, endeavors to persist in its own being. This drive to exist, which is called the conatus essendi, became the central organizing concept of modern ontologies and modern theologies, showing up in a wide variety of philosophies of power. Either one is dominated or dominates. Either one, as thinkers as diverse as Hegel, Sartre, Freud, you name them, said the same thing. In short, to be a human person, qua human, is to have adversaries. The I is structurally aggressive, period. Power is either power over or power under. Difference is by the nature of the case always and incessantly oppositional. Hobbes infamously summed it all up. The stage of nature is a war of all against all. Even if not as explicit to this day, this oppositional self-other paradigm in its various forms is considered the bottom line. My argument is that its effect has been and is far-reaching and pernicious. It even means that love too has a fundamentally narcissistic nature. As Freud postulated, love of neighbor is only possible at the expense of love of self. Loving another, said Freud, depletes the supply of libido available for investment in one's own ego. Following Freud, Lacan and Zizek, and these are the two thinkers I will deal with mainly this morning, or for me, the morning, are two of the most influential thinkers of our day, agree the so-called reciprocity of love, they say, is imaginary. As Lacan says, since to love is essentially to wish to be loved. It's one's own ego that one loves in love. Love is basically an illusion, an illusory fusion. Zizek puts it this way: there is no third which unites and reconciles the two struggling opposites. Love in its very notion is atheist, godless. All we have is the self-grounded abyss of our love. Yes, love relations are not only to be welcomed and recommended, they are necessary. But the bottom line is that they are nevertheless fantasy, a fantasy that we ethically need to traverse. The real thing for Slavoj Žižek, in fact, is the fact that opposition is too weak a word to describe the nature of life. In his big book, Less Than Nothing, 1,000-page book, he defines it this way: the gap or antagonism defines the human condition. He calls it the nothingness of a pure gap. Antagonism, tension, contradiction. This gap, which he calls the real, is opaque, inaccessible, out of reach, and undeniable, impossible to bypass or remove. In it, lack and surplus coincide in a coincidence of opposites. He continues, if we go all the way down, we arrive at the void, at the very bottom. There is all the room we want, since there is nothing else than just the void. As Zizek continues, creation was cracked, very word he uses, from the beginning, an ontological failure. In other words, again in his own words, the fall thus never happens, since it has already happened. Evil is already an anterior, pre-originary power. The primacy of stuckness is the axiom of human life, and negativity, the primordial ontological fact. We begin with the primacy of evil over the good. Good can emerge only afterwards in the space opened up by that evil. Good, in fact, is self-negated evil. The real, for Zizek, following Lacan, is the impossible, the lack which causes desire, before which the imaginary falters and the symbolic stumbles. The real, at the heart of reality, is basically a catastrophe, a trauma that always eludes us and can never be assimilated, mastered. It is a swarming void. Zizek, in fact, says it simply: trauma is eternal, always, already, never in the end to be overcome. Failure is inevitable. We are never healed. That doesn't mean for him that we don't try. We need to keep on trying, even as we realize that the best result is failing better. We are to accept the total contingency of life and no longer look for a guarantee of existence outside of self in another's desire. Zizek's belief, his wager that trauma has always already occurred, has really very real fallouts for daily life. Philosopher Catherine Malibu calls Zizek's words that the trauma has already occurred his most fundamental statement. I agree. It means that all existential traumas are subsequent repeats of the always already traumas intrinsic to creation. And that means that no trauma can ever be overcome, assimilated, only repeated. Trauma is inescapable, preordained, irreparable, and irredeemable, only heroically endured behind the screen of fantasy. The distressing conclusion, in the end, despite every effort, including psychoanalysis, trauma can never be healed, only endured. In Zizek's words, we need to accept the very fact that our lives involve a traumatic kernel beyond redemption, that there is a dimension of our being which forever resists redemption deliverance. Indeed, for Zizek, the true trauma is the subject itself. It's abysmal point, focal point that Hegel called the night of the world. For a human is constitutively out of joint. According to Zizek, Brecht was right. Humans are by nature evil and corrupt. One cannot change them, but only limit their opportunities to actualize their evil potential. The last few years, as I wrestled with Zizek's theory, and maybe will surprise you, agreeing with much of his analysis, one question kept on coming up. Why is he so emphatic, so confident that the real is the void? Yes, there are voids and lacks. Evil is certainly all around us. Disasters abound. But if the real can't be mastered, what and where is the evidence that leads him to be so sure that good is negated evil, that the swarming void is the bottom line and trauma eternal? Then one day, having crawled through his 960, or no, his more than 1,000-page book, Less Than Nothing, this book here, rereading the introduction, I came across this most revealing passage in the introduction on page 17. I will read it. This is what Zizek himself says. The fundamental insight of Hegel resides in transposing an epistemological obstacle into the thing itself as its ontological failure. Then in brackets, he writes, what appears to us as our inability to know the thing indicates a crack in the thing itself, so that our failure to reach the full truth is the indicator of truth. That brought me up short. Really, Zizek declares the gap absolute on the basis of the fact that since humans are unable to reach the full truth about creation, the truth is that there is a basic fault in the creation itself. That to me seems a long reach. It seems to be the authoritarian master language, the very kind of language that a few pages later he resists as he declares it to be his great task, quote, to articulate a space for a revolt which will not be recaptured by one or another version of the discourse of the master. Wow. I think Zizek himself, at the crucial point, resorted to master discourse. The pressing question, why trust that our inability to know the full truth is the indicator of truth? Perhaps, as seems obvious to me, the truth is that humans are not omnipotent, that our abilities are not unlimited, that the mystery of existence may be beyond human understanding. That leads me to my main point, my faith wager, a wager that I share with My favorite feminist philosopher, Luce Irigaray, is the opposite of Lacan and Zizek. The real is not the crack, the void, the self-repelling gap, the less than nothing of the pure real, but the excess of love, self-generating love. If we go all the way down, we land not in the negativity of the abyss, but in the matrix of love. Love is more primordial than evil. Love is the force which drives creation. Love is more primordial than evil. Power over or power under is a perversion of the power of love. Love is the power with. Without is not the first word and the last word. The beginning and the end is not, as Zizek posits, less than nothing. Rather, at the beginning and ending, I think we have what I call withing, the gift and promise of nothing less than love. This allows us to have a non-oppositional paradigm in which power with is the currency, not dominate or be dominated, but power with as against power over or power under. Yes, there is evil and disaster aplenty. Shit happens, but evil is against the grain of the cosmos, a strange, discombobulating, leeching intruder, parasitic on the good. The reality and the promise, even though we all miss the mark of love at times, suffer wounds and feel healing and feel undone, healing can and does take place. Redemption from evil happens. The energy and drive of love, I call it the love of God. God is love, continues to circulate, inviting, luring, healing, and haunting, seeping into cracks and crevices, into every joint and disjoint. Living in our world is what I call dancing in the wild spaces of love. Love is a beautiful risk in which we are called to make love real in this world. It depends on love. It depends on us. But it can and it does happen. Dancing in the Wild Spaces of Love is the title of my new book that is to come out in the next month or two. Creation was not out of nothing, but out of the ever-flowing love of God, a gifting of love that calls us to be agents of love and for love. Love is a gifting that is a calling. Love lures us to be involved in the process, to become letters of love. Zizek claims, quote, "What repeats itself is the real itself, which, lost from the beginning, persists in returning again and again." In an upside down way, I totally agree. What repeats itself for me is the real itself, love, which betrayed at the beginning, for me, not lost, persist in returning again and again. Love for me is the grace of the world's oxygen in which we live and move and have our being. As the lifeblood of the cosmos, love events, generating a creation not only out of love, creatio ex amore, but with love, cum amore, and for love, ad amorem. Life is love, and love is life. We love life because life is love. That is its own reason without any other why. Since to live is to love, life is living for nothing else than loving, which gives life both a rhyme and a reason. To love or not to love, that is the question. I don't know, we don't know. I need to believe, we need to believe, as Derrida said so well. And the English word believe, as Jack Caputo has reminded us, comes from the German word for love, lieben. As Caputo says, to believe is to be love without why. Not the without of the void, but the with of love is the real. So this morning, for me, and for the afternoon for you, I come in praise of love. Thank you. That's as
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. Great. So I guess we can open the floor up here. Does anybody want to have a response to what Jim was saying? Anybody have a thought you want to ask Jim? Jim, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Sure.
Great. I remember taking a picture with you in January at minus 20 degrees in front of that fireplace behind you. You're in your living room.
That's right.
Yeah, that's nice. It's really nice to see you, and want to thank you for your paper, your talk. And yeah, I guess a question that maybe I would pose to you is it, do you think it's just a choice that we make between love and the more the void, the abyss itself? Is it a choice at the fundamental level of existence, and that your choice is simply a choice for the optimistic choice of love, and or the choice of sort of this, there is nothing after all? Is it a choice at the beginning? And
it's both a choice and not a choice. That's it's a very difficult thing to get hold of that. It's beyond rational conceptual analysis. It seems to me that life is so varied for every individual person. And so a lot depends on the atmosphere, where you grow up, and what goes on. But it seems to me that it's not so much a choice, an autonomous choice. It's a choice dictated by the community in which you live. And it's a faith wager. In the end, you look at all the things that have happened and are happening to you, and you need to be able to decide which way to go. And one of the reasons why the void is very popular today philosophically is because there are some people who try to hide the fact that they can't master everything, so they pretend that they can master everything. And that's means that they can, they're right, and that means that they can persecute the people who disagree with them. And so there is a sense in which a lot of the people who are choosing for the void are saying we got to be less sure of our position. We got to be open, and that's why I was so taken back and yet pleased that Zizek, for whom I have much esteem, and I am very close to him on many matters, suddenly admits that, well, the real evidence for the void being the real is simply that we can't master everything. And I thought, boy, he usually doesn't make, I don't think, a mistake like that, but that seems to be, well, it's not a mistake, it's being open and honest.
Yeah.
And we all have to be able to move in a way that's meaningful in life. And now Badiou has gone along the same line, but all of a sudden he doesn't emphasize death as Zizek does. He emphasizes the event of love too. But his event of love seems to, I don't know where it comes from. Because he says he's an atheist. Yeah. And I'm saying, no, the love of God is there inviting us. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's fantastic, Jim. And I look forward to seeing you again. It's too bad you couldn't be here with us in Belfast, but maybe next year you can join us in Dublin in June.
Oh, that would be great.
Yeah.
So, well, I need a few questions from somebody else. I've been a psychotherapist for, 40 years, as you said. And to me, the idea that the void is the bottom line isn't so hopeful. And whereas love gives us an opportunity to heal and be healed, and to participate in healing with others, to be with others, not opposed.
Yeah, and I does anyone want to ask a question? Okay, I'm gonna pass this back to Alfie, who's a professor in London. I'm gonna give me a second because I'm gonna give the microphone, and then, well, if you don't mind, just for the people online as well. We'll just, it doesn't matter. Just pop that on your shirt. And then I'll turn.
I know it's more of a comment really, rather than a question, but like I found kind of interesting. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. What I found kind of interesting is I never actually thought about this kind of void abyss question as like either positively or negatively charged. Like to me, that description of reality coming from the psychoanalytic tradition is kind of neutral. It's not bad. Like I understand that words like void and abyss sound bad, and in religious conversations perhaps they have negative ones, but I think in my understanding of like psychoanalysis was that it did not negatively charge that, like, the real is neither good nor bad. It's a description, it's a neutral description of a kind of structure. So I just wanted to have your thoughts on that, because it's the first time if I've understood your talk right, you're sort of positing that this can be read in two ways. It can be read with a kind of negative inflection, like abyss, void, or it can be read with a positive inflection, which you use love to get at, but kind of just be neutral, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I in a way, we all have to recognize there are the gaps, and the gap it invites us to move, and in the end, for Zizek, the gap is supposed to enliven us to work harder. And so it's kind of a contradictory monism. The fact that there's an emptiness there is the motivation to try to fill it. But Zizek at the same time says, but we will never succeed in filling it. It's always going to be, we always have to do more. And I agree that we never fill it completely, but it doesn't mean that we fail better. I think we can succeed. But if you take it as neutral, I think it fools us into, and it disempowers us in a certain way, even as it could empower us to do something more. Philosophically, this would be a long thing to work on. Freud himself started by saying the basic battle is internal. it's internal in us, and then what goes on in society repeats the internal battle. And I guess my major problem is with that position is that trauma has already occurred. So if it's not neutral, that the gap for them is an ever-ending abyss, and we could try whatever to get out of the abyss, but we never make it. And my sense is that there is the mystery of redemption, that you can find meaning and can be have some solace in life, and you can do this by helping others and helping yourself. So falling in love is a fall, but it's a great fall. It leads to gratitude and wonder. And well,
Great.
say more about that. And
Thank you, Jim. We have Dr. Tatiana Manjolshva from, I think from Serbia. She says a comment in the live stream, but there is a fulfilled void, and that fulfilled void is what she would call love. Would you agree with that?
Yes, in a way I would, yes, because it's because there is a gap. The gap means that we're called to fill it. Love invites us into the process. For me, I think of God as love, but that is the nature of creation. Is the spaces are spaces to be filled, and we're allowed to, and we're called to fill them. We're gifted to fill them, and we're called to fill them. And at the same time, we have to have humble courage. The way we fill the spaces, we can't say that's the way everybody else has to fill them. So yes, I would like that. I like that. The gap is there, and love can fill the gap.
Yeah.
And love is continuous. You never arrive, but it doesn't mean that you're failing. You're just deepening. You're deepening the experience of love.
Wow, that's fantastic. I wish you were here. We would continue the conversation at a pub after.
Well, yes, I think so. We got. Yes, indeed. It's my life is a beautiful risk. That's my psychotherapeutic book.
Yes, love, I remember that. That came out like 10. That came out like 10 years ago, right? What year was that?
Yes, that's right. Well, no, it was about 20 years ago, I think. Just yeah.
Wow.
On 9/11.
Yeah, that's right. I remember as I was starting my PhD program, that book was very important. Thank you. Well, Jim, thank you so much for your great talk and for responding to Alfie's question. And thank you again. Feel free to stay on with us. We're gonna have now Alfie give a talk here, and so we're gonna get set up for that next.
Well, I'll just say blessings to all of you. I mean, that's the I can see a few faces, and that's great.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Muchas gracias. Okay, thank you, Jim. Thanks a lot. So just stand by, and we'll have Alfie get ready for his talk next. And Alfie's talk is entitled "The Corporate Desirevolution." And we're going to have Alfie come up here now, and I'll adjust the camera. Yeah. Thank you, Jim.
Okay.
All right. Actually, I think what I'm going to do, because let me get the camera on you and post this up. Let me do something like that.
All right, cool. I won't be long.
Wait 1 second, Alfie.
Yeah.
And,
but let me just because I was I don't need to show anything, but I just want to.
I can online.
Well, I'm just going to show one image. that I want people to sort of have in their heads. It's a little bit, should there be a sort of a trigger warning for this? It's no, there shouldn't, don't worry, I'm not going to ruin your confidence. It's Colin Farrell's sex tape from 2005. This is like a picture of Colin Farrell sort of close to the point of orgasm. So this is what I'm going to talk about. So basically, when Creston said, I've been sort of sitting on a strange Lacanian reading of Colin Farrell's sex tape for like a couple of years now. And when Creston said that it was going to be in Dublin, I thought, well, you know, this is where Colin Farrell's from, so I would finally bring out this material. But also, in a way, it is also what I'm going to talk about. It connects a lot to what Helen was saying about questions of unconscious desire and so on. But I suppose my interest is in the tech industry rather than film. So thinking about how, so in a way, this is the story of Colin Farrell's sex tape. In another way, it's actually the story of my not so recent divorce. So you'll be in for a treat. And it's also a kind of analysis of the tech industry and its relationship to desire. Which is why I called it the corporate Desirevolution, which is actually a quote from Leotard from the 80s, where he says that we're undergoing a kind of revolution in desire. And what I wanted to do was look at contemporary technology, in particular in the realm of love, and analyze and think about from a kind of psychoanalytic perspective, which is my background, basically what is happening to contemporary desire and the desire of the contemporary subject in relation to technology today. When I separated from my ex-wife, I did a load of weird things, like I got what do you call this? AI dating chatbots girlfriend. I got a headset and a virtual reality girlfriend. Started going to VR pornography brothels in Hong Kong, and visited some sex bots. I played a lot of dating simulators, and tried a smart condom. Would you believe it, which exists? It's like a kind of Fitbit for sex, which kind of tells you how to do it and improve your stats and things. So what I wanted to do was think about like these new forms of technology, of which those are just a dozen examples, let's say, which basically serve the purpose of either mediating between or replacing a relationship. In fact, almost all of those examples, with the exception of the smart condom, maybe dating sites. I also looked at a lot of dating sites, things like that. And I just tried to sort of live in this world of digital sex tech and love tech for a little while, and think actually about what is this doing really? This kind of technologies, from sex bots to smart condoms to simulators, and really kind of try and think it through. Okay, so but I'll start with a quick story about where this actually all started. And it actually, I was in Hangzhou in East China, and I was at China Academy of Art there, and I did a talk about Tencent, who own WeChat, and I was basically slagging off WeChat, saying this is evil because it's this. And at the end of the talk, two guys approached me in suits, and I thought, shit. I thought they were lawyers or something, and they said, oh, we're from Alibaba. And I thought, oh no, God, because Alibaba is like Jack Ma's company. That's like the second or third biggest tech company in China. I thought I'm going to get myself in trouble or whatever. And they actually said, oh, you hate Tencent, right? And I was like, yeah. And they were like, so you might love us. We're Alibaba. And I was like, well, you're both evil. That's the point here. But no, there is actually this kind of odd history, because Alibaba, Jack Ma comes from Hangzhou, and so they're actually quite proud of their, this kind of tech wars, East China and so on, compared to Shanghai and Beijing, where Tencent's from. So there is a history. Anyway, they said to me, why don't you come with us to Cloud Town? I was immediately thinking, this is going to be good. So I got this. Of course, I said to them, honestly, guys, I'm just going to write about how terrible this is, right? And I was writing in The Guardian at the time. And I said, I'm just going to slag you off in The Guardian. You know that, right? And they were like, we don't care. This shows how little the leftist media or liberal media matters, I suppose. But they wanted to show me anyway. So I went there to this place, and they showed some amazing stuff, like things it's amazing in Hangzhou because it's one of the oldest Chinese cities. So it's really traditional architecture and so on, but it's also this kind of prototype smart city where Alibaba are trialing what they call the city brain. So it's like, how do we develop a new kind of smart city where citizens are kind of moving around it in new kind of patterns? And so fascinating stuff, because you've got the really old and the really new stuff right on top of each other. And they showed me loads of stuff, you know, these traffic lights which show count the wrinkles under your eyes and say, well, you're going to take this long to cross a road because, you know, your wrinkle count and so on, and all this stuff. Anyway, but the most incredible thing that this guy showed me was this car. It's a joint project between Alibaba and the car manufacturer Rover. Used to see Rovers, and anyway, I think my grandparents had a Rover. It was an 80s car. He showed me this car. It's got a drone that follows it around and so on and so on. And I said to the guy, like, okay, what is the most impressive thing about this car? I was expecting him to say super fast, looks great, can fly, drives itself. It's the car that can never crash. He didn't say any of that stuff. He said, the car knows when you're hungry and what you might like to eat before you do. And I thought very little of it at the time. I just went. And later on, I started to think about this, why this is important. And so on. I sort of, initially I thought nonsense, you know, but then I sort of asked him, just as we were leaving, I said, well, why does that matter? Like, why did you think that was important? And he said, well, basically, you might want sushi at 4:30 on a Tuesday, but you yourself haven't even realized that you want sushi at 4:30 on a Tuesday. So at 4:20, the car says to you, why don't you come and try this new sushi place or whatever? I'll even drive you there, and so on. And he said, well, the reason why we want to do that is because we can drive people away from places that take WeChat Pay, which is Tencent's own kind of payment system, or places that simply take cash, and we can move them instead to places that take Alipay, which is their own payment system. So, I mean, in a way, this embodies what I think is happening in a nutshell, in a much broader kind of sense. That basically, in this case, it's just a simple corporate interest. You know, they want to drive traffic for their own benefit. But what you're actually looking at is a kind of triangulation between data, desire, and politics, for want of a better way of thinking about it. So in this case, it's just a corporate interest. It's actually not dissimilar to how companies like Cambridge Analytica worked in the run-up to the Brexit election, or companies like Palantir, who offer data-driven solutions. Loads of people who used to work for the NSA now work for Palantir, who do like data-driven. They had an influence in the Iranian election and so on. So it's like how to use data and predictive technology to do what Facebook call nudging, right? So forcing you to act slightly differently to how you would normally act for whatever reason. So it could just be, in Alibaba's case, a really simple nudge to do something that's beneficial to that corporation, right? Similar to how Pokemon Go, one of my favorite apps, placed certain rare Pokemon in expensive shopping malls and Pokestops at McDonald's, and that was brought out by Google after it tried that process, because it's basically thinking about the future of the city and how can we move people around the city in a way that we want them to act, and so on. So, and WeChat has a feature, for example, this heat map feature, which was used to stop riots developing, because it can say that there's a density of people there and they can send police before it gets too big and break up the kind of movement. So there's all sorts of political reasons. You know, Eric Schmidt, the Google CEO, as you probably know, is part of this Pentagon committee now that integrates Google's technologies into the NSA. Jack Ma joined the company. The best book about that is Julian Assange's book, which nobody has read, called When Google Met WikiLeaks, which is like from 2014 or something. Jack Ma then came out as a member of the Communist Party and so on. So these are not just corporate interests, but they're also connected to kind of state politics and so on. And how do we organize the future citizens of the city and so on. So this is the kind of broader context. And what I wanted to do was think about how desire is being reprogrammed and who it's being reprogrammed for. And I think this is also, you know, I agree with a lot of what Helen was saying about the kind of underpinning kind of ideas of desire that sort of make this possible, because, you know, I agree that film, for example, could be this enormously powerful thing that is able to kind of reconstruct or reconfigure desire for a kind of better future. But it can also be, in the example of you know, Hollywood movies and so on. It can also be a deeply ideological way of reprogramming desire to suit a particular agenda that we might want to oppose and so on. So this was a kind of the basis of my feeling of what was going on. And then I wanted to like look at this by actually looking at, you know, and of course, so why does this go to dating and to love and to sex and stuff? Because intimate data is the most valuable, right? And I tend to sort of ramble. I can't even remember when I started, but I'll just quickly mention Grindr, and then I'll try and get to the sex tape. But Grindr shows this problem of data, this data thing. I mean, obviously, everything uses it. Predictive technologies, Spotify, Netflix, everything like that, curation systems, whatever. Grindr is extremely important, and it's so funny, this story. I'll just do it really quickly, basically. I don't know if you've read that Trump wanted it back. So in 2016, Grindr got sold to a Chinese gaming company called Beijing Kunlun Tech that didn't have any data apps. They made augmented reality games. So Grindr as the idea of Grindr as pre-augmented reality is fascinating, I think. There's a gay journalist, Evan Moffat, who's done a lot of work on it. He writes about how he would go to sex parties or have dates with people on Grindr and stay on the phone the entire time, you know, collecting points, collecting reactions from people during these dates, during these kind of sexual experiences, because it was being gamified through the app. So there's this really interesting history of Grindr as like pre-AR. And anyway, in 2016, a gaming company bought it out, so you can actually see concretely that, you know, this gamification of love and desire is happening. But anyway, Donald Trump wanted it back because he realized that the intimate data that was going to be passed over to China would be extremely valuable in kind of predicting and coercing American citizens in whatever way. So you get this really bizarre story. It was all over the media at the time, where basically you got the Chinese government, who are terrible with LGBTQ stuff anyway, fighting this kind of homophobic president to get this gay dating app back that they both want to keep. And it is actually a really fascinating example, because it shows that, you know, that what's important there is the economic value of this, and the culture wars stuff can be thrown out the window, actually, because what's most important is this data, the intimate data. So what I wanted to do is take this thing of intimate data and look at technologies which actually collect it. So things like sex robots, things like Replica, this was the AI girlfriend I had, is actually more compelling than the virtual reality one. You know, in this PowerPoint that I don't know if you guys online can see it, but Creston can just flick through, and there's just just flick through in any order you want. It's just a load of interesting images that show kind of weird sex robots and VR headsets and stuff. But, you know, all of this is just basically the idea that intimate data is being collected and used to kind of nudge desire in different directions, right? There's a really interesting company, two quick VR companies that would be relevant here. One's called Within, which is basically this guy, Chris Milk, who gets people to give money to, it's a philanthropy thing, but using VR in the same way that, you know, filmmaking can do it, or, you know, when you're watching Lenny Henry's thing, Comic Relief, whatever, and you get these kind of really agonizing images of like starving Africans or whatever. And he's done this experiment with the headset and so on, and found that people are much more willing to give to charity after the VR experience than they would be than they are on a 2D screen. Like maybe the sort of, you know, liberal philanthropic soft end of it. But there are companies like this one called Ores London. It's an absolutely amazing place. And basically they use these technologies to get people to invest in businesses. So they'll get potential investors to an event, and then they use like virtual reality, but also like they work by all five senses. They release smells into the room. They have like some specific foods and so on, but they have visual, audio, touch-based stimulus and so on. So there's this kind of whole immersive experience, which is precisely designed to get investors to invest in XYZ businesses and so on. So you're really seeing this kind of, you know, this is the more scary end of it, I suppose, this kind of revolution in the technology, which is impacting in new and unprecedented ways our bodies through all of our senses, but also empathy, desire, feeling, and so on, and trying to nudge us in particular different directions through these things. So to come into the last 5 minutes, I think I've got time for that. One of the most interesting, and in you know, I've written about all of this stuff in different case studies, if you want to look at it, like sex bots, smart condoms, all these different communities. But one of the most interesting is the VR pornography world. Now, it probably won't surprise you to know that it is by far So you wouldn't, the tech industry would have you believe, you know, if you think about the metaverse and so on, that VR was like part of this kind of science fiction future where anything is possible. But something like 97% of VR is porn, and it's terrible porn. No, not in an ideological way. I don't judge that. But basically, I tried to explore this capacity. How would this work then when if you take that idea that comes from that company, that comes from these ideas that desire can be nudged and changed, and especially with, you know, headsets with technology, what does it mean then to kind of go into the headset in the world of virtual reality pornography and kind of experience kind of these forms of desire that exist there? And I was, you know, I was expecting to come out of this experience wanting to criticize it, right? Like I was going to say, look how misogynistic it is, look how capitalist it is, look how right-wing it all is, patriarchal and so on. And I didn't actually feel that experience made me want to say those things. And I'll try and sort of say why with some kind of psychoanalytic kind of reading of it. Now, what happened to me when I went into these virtual reality pornography worlds was that I felt like I was being, I was inhabiting another person's body. So there are two forms. There's a form where you just use a camera like this, but 360 camera, anyone can buy one. And then they just put a bed and people have sex on it. And you're just your vision is the 360 camera. So you're just in the room. That I didn't find so interesting. You know, it was just like porn. The one that is incredibly interesting is the headset from the POV, because you literally have another man's body, usually, and another man's penis, and you look down and, you know, it's there. You know, so and it's quite striking. Actually, I was totally thrown the first time I entered, and obviously one could think about that in terms of castration, which it quite literally is, right? It's this kind of fantasy penis which replaces the real one, and so on. So you have to kind of be castrated to be in there. But what struck me as most important was the fact that in quite a sort of direct way, you're experiencing someone else's desire. Right. And in actual fact, lots of desire works this way. And what I wanted to do, if I was talking for longer, the theorist I would use to think about this is Mladen Dolar, the kind of Zizek'ian Lacanian writer, whose book A Voice and Nothing More talks about the question of ventriloquism when we speak. So basically, Dolar argues that there's a kind of minimum of ventriloquism in every speaking subject, basically. So in other words, when we speak, we are always, to a certain extent, a minimum portion of this speech is this kind of imitation of someone else's speech and so on. And that happens however we speak. And I would apply that here in the sense that desire also has this kind of ventriloquist quality, where basically it isn't in fact your desire, or at least part of it is an other's desire, right? And you're kind of invited, quite literally in this case, to step into someone else's desire and experience this fantasy. And it's very possible, I don't know if anyone is seasoned porn viewers here, it's very possible for those of you that watch a lot of porn to enjoy things you didn't expect to enjoy, right? It's very possible. And this strikes me as also possible in all of life. And if I had longer, I'd want to apply this to things like Brexit, actually, and how nobody actually wants Brexit, but we want to want it like those people we can see wanting it, you know, and how desire has this kind of mimicry going on that, you know, and the pro-Brexit media, like Farage, what he would do is precisely that. He would show people in a pub going, Brexit, Brexit. And so that you would look at that and think, I want to be chanting that. I want to feel that desire. I'm being invited to step into this space of desire and experience it as if it's someone else's. Okay, so I think this is a critical understanding of desire. And it all comes from the Colin Farrell sex tape, right? Because, and this really is the last minute, because when I watched this, in 2005, when it was new. So this is how long I've been thinking about this point, 17 years. And I like Colin Farrell. You know? I don't know if that's before or after In Bruges, but I was already a fan of Colin Farrell. And so, you know, one thing that struck me is why celebrity tapes? I mean, we could use the Kardashian one as an example, but I'll tell you why the Colin Farrell one's the one. But, you know, what you get to do here with celebrity sex tapes is sort of slip in the same way you do with the virtual reality headset. right? You get to embody someone else's desire. And in this case, there's already a fantasy of who this person is, right? So it happens with all porn, but with a celebrity, there's already a fantasy, an idea of who this person is, and you're allowed to step into this scene, right? Which is, and experience it from the point of view of either your choice, the celebrity or whoever they're having sex with. So I was thinking about this and watching the Colin Farrell one, like, what I'm getting out of this here is being Colin Farrell. And it's a terrible video. So and this is an important point, but it still works, right? And the real clinching point for me is I was aware of myself watching this thinking, well, what I'm getting out of this is this ventriloquist desire. Like, I'm getting to allow Colin Farrell's desire to speak through me. And this is part of the fantasy. But then he starts saying in his Irish voice, princess fucking gets what princess fucking wants. And he keeps saying it, princess gets. But like, for my last birthday, someone got me a birthday card saying princess gets with Colin Farrell's face on it. But this is, I am making a point here, I'm not just that basically what does this show? He is actually imagining himself, and he's doing some kind of weird role reversal where she is, I think, some kind of possibly a sex worker, and he is this extremely rich actor or whatever. He's doing something there with this, and he keeps uttering it in the weirdest moments. You've got to see it. Like, it comes out of nowhere, this voice, and it just says, princess gets, princess. And it's just like, you can sort of see that he is trying to experience someone else's desire as well. Right, so he is trying to not be Colin Farrell in this moment, but be someone else. So this is why this particular tape, and you know, please do spend I've given you this one thing today, it's to watch this tonight. It's a great, you know, piece of film. But okay, so I'm going to finish now just by saying that it could be, and thinking about a better future and so on, you know, that desire, this quality of desire, this fact that it functions in this way, could actually be quite a leftist position, let's say. It might even be possible that this desire is the only universal thing, right? If this is how desire works, it can cross all boundaries, right? So in a world of sort of identity politics and divides between this people and that person, and if you think about how Facebook organizes this, I mean, for example, one thing I went on was Trump.dating, the dating site for Trump only fans. There's also a Atlasosphere, the Ayn Rand dating site. You know, what the logic of this is to say that Trump people want this, right-wing people want this, Guardian soulmates liberals want this, and it's to put you in different pockets. But actually, if you think about desire in this psychoanalytic sense, it becomes a completely universal thing, actually, that could cross all political boundaries and all kind of social, cultural divisions. So my view is that the Colin Farrell sex tape shows you a kind of socialist desire that you can experience. There you go. That's it. Yeah, no, that's it. And I think that we should take this idea of desire and explore it further. And these new technologies which exist allow us to play with desire in new ways. And I think this is where it also connects with ideas of what filmmaking can do, right? There is now this extremely interesting range of technologies that are co-opting our desire in the service of capitalists, of corporations, and of other political agendas. But this is also an opportunity to kind of explore desire in new ways and think about how we want to kind of read it and what we want to do with it. Okay, I'll stop.
That was great. Thank you.
Right.
I'll take the mic.
Oh, the mic.
Yeah. Wait, are there questions? Yeah, no, let's do so. Wait, Helen's responded with a need for questions.
I've got like 2 questions.
Okay.
Like,
Would you stand
first one-
close to
Yeah, where shall I go? Oh, the microphone.
Just
Yes.
sit here.
I'll
Just
sit here.
Right, the first one is that this idea of like
Okay.
universal desire. There is something in the nature of desire, the lack of nature of desire, that is universal, that crosses like every identity group. And you know, there's this question of like being queer, and I think this idea of queerness that has come to mean like an excluded group historically because there was a belief or an understanding of desire is not lacking, and then this was like a form of desire that was not fitting and was different in some like actual essential way. But maybe the question really, instead of like, you know, that identity politics is sort of step one in relation to desire, is that in a sense we are all queer in the way that
Yeah.
queerness was excluded as a legitimate form of desire in its sort of lackingness, but actually we're all not so different.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And one of the things, like I said, one of the things that I found really interesting is I also looked at like weird kind of online cults and groups which are usually associated with like 4chan and the far right and stuff, like these kind of groups like men go their own way, and there's the concept like sexual market value and stuff that comes. And what I always found in these spaces is actually, although they're sort of deploying this idea for a different agenda, they're more or less the same, right? It's not actually possible to just be like, you know, the liberal media would have you think, look at these weirdos online, look at like incels, for example, and the relationship between this, and, you know, look at these bunch of weirdos online that are completely alien to us, right? And we're kind of pure and they're not, or whatever. You know, absolutely, that I didn't find to be the case. You can see the same structure, and the fact that Grindr, you know, which had this long history of being the only kind of it's the only dating site that's not owned by this Match group, who own all of them basically. But you know, the fact that that had the same structure in as well, even though it's historically well, it's really for gay men historically, but now it's quite open. So yeah, in that sense, it is exactly right. Desire doesn't sort of stop. The whole problem of like identifying as straight, queer, whatever it might be, is only half of the problem. Yeah.
And there's kind of the oppositionalizing the level of desire sustains that whole dialectic of like, you know, the capitalists believe that there is a wholeness in desire, but yeah, when it's the universal value. I was going to ask one thing about tyranny. But do you want to go first though? No. So the question of tyranny was like, it's interesting because you're talking about like corporate desire revolution. So we have this idea of like corporate desire. You know, you think of a film like Brazil, where it's this totalitarian illogic. You know, totalitarian as in like, it's this system which you can't escape, but of course it doesn't make sense because totalitarianism is never total enough. Like the contradiction has to go somewhere. So, but that's like what we kind of think of corporations, you know, is this sort of totalitarian. But in a sense, what you're talking about with these people enticing investors and stuff, it's more like tyrannical when you have like individual people deciding how to control.
No, absolutely.
Like, in a sense, not to be like tyranny is positive in any way, but it's just different. Right?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. And I think actually what you said in your talk would be relevant for it, because I think the problem here is that capitalism kind of makes you not see this.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So it's not that this shouldn't be happening. This has to happen. This is how desire works. Yeah. But what capitalism does, what that company does, is it makes people believe that they want to do it. So when you like step into this virtual reality, you're sort of tricked, I suppose, into thinking like, oh, I want this, but you don't want this. You're just temporarily suspended inside this kind of desire metric, you know. So yeah, so the point would be to kind of show that. And
that's the thing, because it's like almost like the end of history in terms of desire could be exposing the dynamics of desire rather than finding, you know, obviously we don't know where we're going in the future. We could have some like communist revolution, or it could be even more shit, like we could repress the contradiction even further, but actually exposing desire when, like in a way that seems like kind of scary because it's like not positive, but then you actually understand the dynamic of desire, and there's an emancipatory potential just in that dynamic.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's no coincidence that like in my personal case, I found that in what I thought was going to be the very worst.
Yeah.
You know, like even with sex robots, there are like interesting experimental, like, you know, sex robot brothels and stuff. But like this one, the VR porn stuff, I thought like, this is the bad stuff, but it's actually the most interesting in a way.
Yeah, it's like the wolf in wolf's clothing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which I think does, you know, accidentally confront you with how this desire functions and so on. So, and I guess, yeah, like with the filmmaking, like it'll have an effect, you know, on you. You don't have to like understand it and talk about it. It actually works. Yeah. Good. Yeah, thanks. Right, who should I pass this to?
Yeah, Barry. I'm still thinking.
No, it's fine. Barry, no. Okay, you good?
Yeah, no, I'm good.
Okay. Yeah, that's nice. Thank you. That was incredible. And Todd McGowan. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, here. I'm going to give the mic to Barry.
Next question. I wonder, alongside all of that, if the whole notion of that maybe that in that VR experiment. Perhaps it's a return to an understanding of desire that we never knew we had, because we live in the microcosm of the hyper individualized world. You know what I mean? And there's a, does that make sense? You know, the sort of commonality of desire as this thing. It's not what we thought it was, but it's actually what we all have and we all share.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think it's a really important point politically to make, because I'll just be very quick, because these technologies are actually designed to do the opposite. Like I was saying, they're designed to sort of put you in your bubbles and say that these are your desires and these are someone else's. So we're in a kind of technological and political moment which is trying to divide us on the basis of desire, but it forces accidentally the realization that that is actually what we have in common, and that's where I think there is a possibility with it too. So I think that's a great point. Any further? Then I think we're good. We're good. Thank you. We've solved desire.
I think we could keep doing this for a while. This is really incredible.
It's good
impressive
talk as well.
Yeah, that's right. Well, great. So and now we move on to Todd McGowan's talk. Todd's joined us online, and I just want to ask folks. There's Todd. I just want to ask folks who just give us a second to make sure, because we're doing multiple platforms here. It's the first time. And I want to just give us a second to make sure that we're getting Todd's image while he talks. So Todd, just give me a second. I'm going to see what I can do. I'm going to replace the pin. Okay, great. So I can hear you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Okay. So there's a latency between the Zoom and the platform. Manuel, could you come and just make sure that we're pinning Todd, replace pin. Okay, so it looks like now, Todd, just give us a second to make sure. Okay, you are now on YouTube with Helen, who's sitting on the couch. See, that's the YouTube, right?
That's YouTube right there.
Okay. Oh, okay, great. Okay, super. Todd, we're ready to go. I'd like to just introduce you for a moment. Thanks, first of all, for joining us. Hope everything's okay in Vermont. And let me just make sure. Again, sorry, we're just getting the
worries
pinning done. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. How's things in Vermont?
They're pretty fine. Nice day.
Are you getting the spring coming up yet?
Yeah. It's
Nice. Okay, that's great. So we're just looking at the YouTube, and it just has it's just a blank screen with GCAS on it. So we're just gonna try to work that out. And in the meantime, thank you all for joining us on YouTube. Alfie just went, and that was quite extraordinary. Yeah. So, Manuel, this is still on YouTube, or?
Yes, when you see the screen, that's what's
Okay, so let's just try it again. Replace pin, and let's see if that goes.
When you talk, Creston, your screen is going to come in.
Oh, okay, yeah. I'm gonna pause myself, Todd, and give it about 5 seconds, and then you can start talking, and then it'll come on to you. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Okay, well, welcome. Thanks, Todd McGowan.
You want to use this sound here just because of the delay?
Sure, if you have the sound. Okay, so Manuel's going to put the sound here in Belfast. Okay, Todd, you're on in about 10 seconds. Go for
10
it.
seconds? Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yep. Okay. I'll start. All right. Okay. I don't know how it's possible to follow up Alfie's talk, which was incredible. And I have no references to any cool sex tapes or anything. So that I feel a little bit symbolically castrated. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about a title that Creston gave to me. So I didn't give to myself, but I'm happy to talk about lack and not lacking. And I'm going to talk about it in terms of alienation. So and in praise of alienation and in praise of lack. So alienation sounds very unappealing. It sounds as if it takes something away from us that we originally have or originally are, and it leaves us immersed in what's foreign. So it creates the impression of being a disruptive process that we should find a way to avoid. But I think alienation and lack get a bad rap. The paradox of both alienation and lack, which I think are synonyms, is that it doesn't mark a deviation from some original identity that we once had and lost, but instead constitutes who we are. So subjectivity is inherently alienated subjectivity. It emerges through a displacement that defines us and defines it. So our separation from ourselves is actually what enables us to be who we are by emphasizing that we are inextricable from something foreign within us. And the name is the first mark of alienation that most people receive. So no child initially names itself, right? I'm a slight exception to this because when just after I was born, my mom put a hat with a bunch of names in it and then put my little hand into the hat, and whatever name I grabbed became my name. So I picked my name, Todd. But then she told me this story my whole young life. And then she confessed to me just recently, she's gotten Alzheimer's, and she was in a confessing mood. And she said, actually, I gamed the system and I put all the names. You did pick your name, but all the choices were Todd. So even when you actually do get to choose, you don't get to choose. So a name, I think, stands for this act of violence that some authority perpetuates on the incipient subject. So parents, some other adults impose this alien name on the child, either arbitrarily or in a sense that they want to approximate what the child will become, right? So one could even experience one's name as perfectly appropriate, as completely one's own, but it still remains this alien imposition. So others place a destiny on the child through its chosen name. Parents might name a child Ernest, I'm thinking of the Oscar Wilde play, in hopes that it will grow up to be honest and forthright. Or they might name a child Grace, a friend of mine did this, with the idea that it would become decorous and elegant. Parents could even employ the name of artists like Langston or Dashiell. We have a son named Dashiell who's right outside the door. Hopefully he won't hear this, so that their children could partake of this genius by association. Most typically, however, I think we give names that have a family history attached to them to remind the child of the lineage that should inform their future comportment. In each case, the child doesn't choose its name, but confronts the name as this alien imposition. And if the child comes to see the name as identical with itself, it only occurs after this initial alienation, which is why the name stands for what the child lacks. The name is the name of lack. So alienation and lack's bad rap, I think, stem from a fundamental misconception of lack. We constantly experience ourselves as lacking subjects, no matter how many things we have or how tight our relations with others become, no matter how much we love, to reference an earlier talk, or even how contented we feel. Lack persists. As a result of the constancy of its lack, subjectivity always exists in reference to a missing plenitude. So people might locate this plenitude in a lost past, Garden of Eden, or in a future to be attained like a communist utopia. And in any case, lack seems to refer necessarily to plenitude. And I think this is one of the reasons why lack is misunderstood. So one of the challenges of being figures of lack is that we must try to conceive lack without any reference to plenitude, to think of alienation without measuring it up to a perfect self-identity. So we lack, but we don't lack anything that could possibly make us whole, nor do we lose anything that deprived us of an original wholeness. So thinking lack without reference to wholeness, I think, changes the political valence of lack and alienation. So lack and alienation are the sources of all human suffering. If we weren't alienated, we couldn't suffer, but they're also the sources of all satisfaction. So without alienation, we would exist bereft of anything that makes life worth living, because we would lack the space in which to act contrary to what we were given and contrary to the given as such. So as a result, alienation makes possible every enjoyable activity, from having sex to watching Colin Farrell's sex tape, to eating cake, to discussing German idealism. So what separates speaking beings from the rest of the universe is their ability to grasp their own alienation. So nothing that exists is self-identical, not even the most solid rock or the emptiness of dark matter. There's nothing that escapes some kind of alienation. but our very capacity for becoming aware of entities indicates their lack of self-identity, their openness to the rest of the universe that derives from a failure of self-identity. But language, I think this is what makes subjectivity different. Language gives subjects the ability to recognize their own alienation as what constitutes them as who they are. So there's an ability to grasp embrace one's alienation that defines subjectivity and separates subjectivity from other non-subjective entities. So other entities exist in a contradictory status, but they never can gain any purchase on it without language. So they exist until they succumb to the contradictions that define them. The distance that language introduces into the speaking being changes the relationship to alienation. So I think distance is really a crucial idea, crucial injection that language includes in subjectivity. So subjects of the signifier can recognize themselves as alienated and take up their own alienation as what defines them. They can enjoy their lack rather than just perishing from it, one might say. So, but I think the refusal to see alienation as constitutive works against this possibility. So most political projects, I think, begin with the aim of putting an end to alienation. So from fascism, it's obvious, to capitalism, to communism, all three are political projects, alienation remains the problem that politics envisions solving. Of course, each project envisions eliminating alienation in dramatically different and politically opposed ways. So fascism wants to create true belonging through the leader who expresses a national and ethnic identity. Fascists see themselves as becoming who they really are in the national or ethnic movement. Capitalism promises the overcoming of alienation through the accumulation of commodities, of course, obtaining more and more. As a capitalist sees it, appears to hold the possibility for achieving some kind of ultimate self-identity. Communism, for its part, I think, aims at overcoming the alienation of workers from the products of their labor. So achieving a communist society would entail putting an end to the alienated labor that occurs under capitalism. Standard definition of communism from the 1844 manuscripts of Marx. So despite this radical diversity of these political programs, alienation is in each case what they work to stamp out. So politics as such seems to exist only insofar as it envisions an end to alienation. And alienation appears as the status quo that demands a political response. So I think the idea is that alienation itself is non-political and that politics is a response to alienation. But my claim would be that we need to take a completely opposite view of alienation, and that the political effort to overcome alienation is actually not a radical response to the current state of things, but an inadvertent acceptance of the status quo. So instead of trying to overcome alienation and accede to some unalienated, non-lacking existence, we should redeem alienation and lack as an existential and political program on its own. So the wager is that alienation and lack, the recognition that alienation is what constitutes us as who we are, is fundamentally emancipatory. So I think we've failed to see the emancipatory quality of alienation because theorists have wrongly understood its structure and wrongly linked alienation to oppression. So what disrupts our self-identity is not a problem we have to try to overcome, but instead the basis of our ability to struggle against whatever ruling ideological structure is in place. So without alienation, instead, I think we're beings reducible to our social context, imprisoned in a given form of identity. So what's given would be completely determinative if we weren't alienated. So redeeming alienation as a force for emancipation allows us to reevaluate the political aims involved in emancipation. So the point is to recognize alienation as an attractive alternative rather than as a condition that we want to escape from without any prospect for ultimate success. So this, I think, requires reconceptualizing what oppression is. So even though we often think of it in this way, I think oppression cannot be the experience of lack, since lack is constitutive of subjectivity. And I think one of the common ways of thinking about the relationship between lack and oppression is, okay, lack is this thing that's universal, and then oppression occurs in these particular different ways. I think that is not correct. So I think those who are oppressed are actually not fated to be lacking subjects, with no possibility of overcoming their lack. Instead, I think oppression, what it does is it places a barrier in the way of recognizing oneself as lacking and of confronting the impossibility of desire. So in an oppressed situation, one does not experience the contradiction of subjectivity, but instead experiences oneself as an internally coherent entity. So oppression obscures, on both sides, I think, on the side of the oppressor, on the side of the oppressed. Oppression obscures one's status as an alienated subject, since it transforms one into the appearance, of a self-identical entity. So, of course, most people know what oppression looks like. It's a social order that leaves a mass of people in poverty, condemns a certain group to lesser life chances than others, or it ostracizes some for their specific proclivities. So to regard someone in an oppressive way, I think, is to classify the person as a substantial entity or as a whole. It is to refuse to allow this person to exist as a divided and contradictory subject with desires that are at odds with themselves. So let's look at the way, for instance, the Rassemblement National approaches Muslim immigrants in France. So from this political party's perspective, these immigrants cannot be alienated subjects, even though one might imagine living as a Muslim in today's France would be incredibly alienating, given the prejudice that one has to endure. Instead, the desire of Muslim immigrants is clear. They repudiate French laïcité, they deny the equality of women, and they want to impose Sharia law on the nation. They destroy the country's Catholic heritage, etc. Right? It's clear. This oppressing viewpoint does not permit Muslim immigrants their alienation. That is, their mixed desires relative to laïcité, to enforced equality, and to France. Instead, we can see another desire of how oppression works, I think, in Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. In this work, Beauvoir describes the oppression of women through agrarian history. She basically, this is the history of agrarian society, she isn't really interested in hunting gathering societies. And she thinks it's a reduction of the feminine to an image of self-identity. So to be treated as a woman is to be regarded as incapable of experiencing alienation from oneself. Even though Beauvoir at times describes how the oppressive process is, in fact, women's alienation, I think she's actually recounting the inability of women within patriarchal society to recognize their alienation. This is the sense of her famous statement that woman wallows in immanence, but first she was enclosed in it. So to wallow in immanence is to be what one is, to be unable to recognize oneself as alienated in one's identity. Or I think one could say that de Beauvoir describes femininity as the reduction of female subjectivity to the status of an identity. So to understand how alienation operates, we have to start with this basic disjunction that I think most people are aware of between subjectivity and identity. So subjectivity comes into existence through alienation. A breach develops between what we mean and what we say, between our intention and our act, between consciousness and the unconscious. We're alienated beings because what we say articulates our desire, not what we mean. So the opposition between our unconscious desire, that was a nice slip, and our conscious willing or conscious wishing. So in the same way, our acts display who we are despite what we intend to do. The unconscious is not this private secret, but what we constantly demonstrate to others through our speech and our acts. So we confront the truth of our subjectivity in this speech and in these acts, but it appears to us only in an alien form as what we do not will or what we do not intend. So this is, I think, one of the ways in which our alienated subjectivity reveals who we are, not what we believe we are. So who we are as a subject is a problem that has no solution. It's a question that has no answer. So symbolic identity of whatever stripe attempts to construct a solution to this problem. It provides markers that block the question of the subjectivity's question of who one is. It's impossible to avoid having an identity, obviously. This is what allows us to navigate our social situation. But I think we can relate to identity from a distance by recognizing that we are actually alien to it. We can confront symbolic identity from the perspective of our alienated subjectivity. So I think that's the key idea for me, confronting symbolic identity from the perspective of alienated subjectivity. So the search for an identity that fully corresponds to who we are is an attempt to cure alienation, to cure lack. Identity obscures the lack of subjectivity by making the subject appear to be its identity. So while the subject is out of joint with itself, identity creates the appearance of a self-coincidence, even if the identity is one of permanent flux. So I think this is this Deleuzian attempt to get out of it, I think still falls into the same problem. So by recognizing every identity as a failure, we can remain within the question of subjectivity itself. And grasping alienation as constitutive for oneself as a subject is what Hegel, in the Phenomenology of Spirit, calls absolute knowing. So at this point, one finds oneself at home in what is alien, or as Hegel puts it, for the self-knowing spirit, in its otherness as such, it is at one with itself. I just thought one of my favorite Hegel lines, although there's so many to choose from. So to be at home with to be at home in one's otherness is to make a home out of one's homelessness, to make a home out of this constitutive alienation of subjectivity, to embrace being out of place as the only possible relationship to place. And I think doing so requires being comfortable with the uncomfortable. Only by accomplishing this can we sustain the problem of subjectivity without rushing toward a solution that will always make matters worse. And I'd like to end with a little, I think, story that I think illustrates this point pretty well. So a guy comes home late from work. He's like 4 hours late, and his spouse is fuming mad. She's like, "Where were you?" And he goes, "Well, I stayed at the bar playing poker with my friends." And she's like, "Okay, that's it. I've had it. Pack your bags. You're out of here." And he goes, "Well, you can pack your bags. You're out of here too, because I lost the house playing poker." So I think that's to me, I did tell that joke very well. But the point is that that constitutive homelessness, it applies not just to the person who's throwing the person out, but to both parties involved. And I think that's the key idea. Okay, that's it.
Thanks, Todd. There's a latency, so we're just going to hold off. Can you mute yourself just for about 15 seconds? Thanks. All right, one more time. Mute that. Okay, great. I'm going to, okay, good. So Todd, we have some questions coming your way. I'm just going to pass the microphone about in the room, and then you can unmute yourself and respond. One moment. Any questions? Or comments? Okay, great. Here's Alfie. He's gonna respond. Just hold it.
It's me again, Todd. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's extremely interesting. Yeah, thanks a lot. I guess I wanted to ask about how you just I mean, I suppose we've spoken about it before, but I'd like to say something about how you think it's like a particularly what is the like relevance or importance of this position like right now, politically speaking, or like culturally speaking, because it's interesting, isn't it? Because on the like some of the stuff you described, it's like this is a long-standing kind of part of psychoanalytic discourse, but it does seem, I think you're right, that it seems to have like a particular kind of importance today. And like, so can you just speak to that? Like what is the kind of part of this that you think is like critical in this political moment? Because it seems to me that that's like, that is the case, but I'm not entirely sure why it's the case now, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, that's a great question, Alfie. Am I delayed too? Or is it, I can just...
No, you're fine.
Okay, I'll just speak. I like this idea of a latency between the things. So I'm still in the latency period myself. So I appreciate that. Yeah, it's a good question. And I think that it seems like my answer is going to be a little too economically determinist, that we live in a particular point within the development of capital where the response to it is almost paradoxically, universally particularist. And so I feel like that it's clear that people have, one of the reasons is I think we live in the wake of the communist experiment, and the fact that that is what got identified with the possible universal response to capital. So I think so now the response is this identitarian response, is that like that becomes the way to combat capitalist oppression. And so I feel like that the need to find a different form of universality in response is really crucial today. And so I think I guess to me, that's why
No, I agree with that. It's a good answer. Yeah.
that's how I would think of it.
Yeah, great. Yeah, who wants this? No, I think that's a really, really good answer. I totally agree. Anyone?
Okay, great. Thanks, Todd. Excellent, and I really appreciate your participating with GCAS and giving us a kind of in-depth work through the subject as alienation, liberation, emancipation. So it was really great. Sure. Thanks so much, Todd, for joining us. I wish you were here in Belfast next year. You'll be hopefully in Dublin with us.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Okay, take care.
Fantastic. Thanks, Todd.
Yep.
Bye now.
Bye.
Okay, good. So thanks for tuning in, for those of you watching on the YouTube. And we're going to conclude today's symposium with a talk by Rocky Gangle. Rocky Gangle is a professor at Endicott College, full professors, published several books. He's also hasn't slept in like 36 hours. So it's really kind of great to have him here with us, and we're going to get set up here. If you want to just sit there, you can sit there, and I'll just give you the mic, unless you want to come up here. It's up to you.
Yeah, let's not even bother with the slides.
Okay, sure. If you want to sit up here, that's great. Or
yeah, do it near me.
Yeah, don't move. Let me just pop this on there, like that. Okay, you're
perfect. Yeah. Testing. 1, 2, 3.
Go ahead.
Testing. Can you hear me?
I can do it.
Testing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is the sound is coming through?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
So I'm going to just adjust the camera for one moment, and then we'll go.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. I really appreciated the earlier talks. I'm struck by the sense of displacement as we're here talking to each other, and then the virtual conversations, and these lags and so forth. And that I think this has become part and parcel of our ordinary experience over the last few years. I had a talk just a week or so ago with some musicians, and we were talking about theory. One of the musicians had a bad Wi-Fi connection, and as she was elaborating something about Francois Laurel, the sound started to lag and started to go wah, wah, Laurel, grr, grr, grr. And it struck me, this is a strange kind of aesthetic opportunity that we're confronted with all the time now, which is to inhabit these very weird displacements and experiment with them. And I think this maybe has some relation to what I want to talk about briefly. I'll try to keep it kind of a cut to the chase today, which is the work of Giorgio Agamben. And in particular, the concept that has become, I think, central in his work in the last few volumes of his now kind of 9-volume magnum opus, the Homo Sacer project. So the last 3 volumes are The Highest Poverty, Opus Dei, and The Use of Bodies, which now concludes it as the 9th volume. And one of the things that I find really interesting in these last 3 volumes is that it seems as if the overall project of Agamben here finally aims at some kind of positive program. That is it's not just a critique of Western notions of sovereignty, but he introduces the notion of form of life, which usually hyphenates form of life as something like the thing that he's calling for as the kind of political ontology of the potential political ontology of the future. So in a nutshell, what I'd like to do is try to think about this notion of form of life in Agamben and read it through the notion of form of life in Wittgenstein, and especially Wittgenstein's kind of paradox of rule following, as read by Saul Kripke. Kripke has this wonderful book, Wittgenstein on Private Language, and I think that there's an interesting connection to be made between Wittgenstein and Agamben that can help us to see what it is maybe that he's really calling for in these recent works. But in terms of, I guess I'll kind of follow the plan of the talk. That I kind of wanted to begin with Foucault, just because I happened to pick up recently the first set of lectures that Foucault gave to the Collège de France in 1970. He got this kind of wonderful gig being able to give these kind of public lectures. And the first series that he gave in 1970-71 were lectures on the will to know. And so Foucault himself describes this. He says, the game I would like to play in his inaugural lecture, it's a matter of seeing what real struggles and relations of domination are involved in the will to truth. And he begins with Aristotle. And he says, okay, we have this opening line of Metaphysics Alpha, all people, all men by nature desire to know. And Foucault has this kind of magisterial reading of this this passage and the turn to vision that happens immediately afterward. And the upshot is that Foucault wants to see in this utterance of Aristotle a kind of originary gambit of philosophy to embed knowledge at the heart of desire. That knowledge, desire is already knowledge, and therefore always the desire for knowledge. And he then makes this kind of nice move where he says the real kind of synthetic term between desire and knowledge is a kind of a deeper level of truth. So just to cite Foucault here, underneath the text, Aristotle's, that spoke of a sort of natural desire to know, and seemingly prior to any knowledge, beneath this text, there were two operations. One that reintroduced knowledge underneath desire and at its very source, and the other, even more hidden, that introduced truth as a third element between desire and knowledge. So this kind of canonical notion of a synthetic third that would overcome the dichotomy or the opposition. Here, truth is the kind of synthetic ground of desire and knowledge that ensures that knowledge is always at the heart of desire. And then he lays out this kind of turn to Nietzsche. And he says, if in Western philosophy until Nietzsche, desire and will were never able to rid themselves of their subordination to knowledge, if the desire to know was always doubled by the precondition of knowledge, the reason is this fundamental relationship to truth. And this is where I'd like to introduce Agamben, because I think that this is one of those things that happens a lot in French theory, which is this kind of grand gesture of not until Nietzsche did we, or none other than Kant has ever seen, which always overlooks something. And in this case, overlooks a wide swath of medieval scholasticism, and in particular, the Franciscans. that I think the Franciscans are a really interesting movement in Western intellectual history, where in some sense, knowledge is subordinate to desire. Will, at least in the divine will and intellect, will is in some sense prior to intellect. And this plays out then in terms of Franciscan ethics, Franciscan theology in general. And I think that's part of what's in the background of Agamben turning to the Franciscans in the highest poverty as this kind of model for the kind of thing that he's aiming toward, that he calls form of life. The Franciscans and the basically the monastic order, the discalced Carmelites, seem to be doing something in the 13th century that Agamben wants to hold open as still kind of something like a live option, whatever that. And I don't claim to know what the hell that means, but it seems like an interesting call to say, like, hey, look at the Franciscans, look at the Franciscan order, messing on the one hand with the church hierarchy, but also messing with the kind of newly independent university system, right? And kind of creating this new third thing. So to sum up Foucault, Foucault then introduces his reading of Nietzsche by saying, at a first approximation, Nietzsche's texts can and should be read as an attempt to free the desire to know from the form and law of knowledge. And this is what kind of woke me up reading all this Agamben recently, the form and law, which is something that Agamben is trying to do in thinking of form of life. He's trying to disentangle notions of form and law. So what would a form of life be that was a form not subject to law? What is the form, the regula and the forma of a life that would not be beneath or under the law? So I think most people are probably at least somewhat familiar with Agamben's general project. On the one hand, going back to his earliest work, he's interested in a metaphysics, especially in Aristotelian metaphysics of potential, of the notion of dunamis, and that he thinks that this is a very, very important concept to be worked throughout the Western tradition. What is potential dunamis if it is not just possibility? And then linked to this, especially in the Homo Sacer project, is the critique of the Western notion of sovereignty in political theory and political theology, and the kind of move that opens Homo Sacer and continues all the way through the 9 volumes is the idea that sovereignty in the Western tradition is grounded in a constitutive exclusion of bare life. And he kind of indexes this with the Greek terms bios and zoe. So these are 2 Greek terms for life. Bios seems to always suggest some kind of social ordering, that even when it applies to animal groupings, it's always a kind of group in their interaction. It's something like a way of life of some group. It's the life of the polis. It involves bios. Zoe is something more like life in general, right? Plants have zoe, but not bios, for example. So the idea is that there's a constitutive exclusion of zoe in order to form the political order of bios. So what does Agamben mean by this kind of new term form of life that he introduces? He defines it at one point in The Use of Bodies in terms of the inseparability of life and form. He says, with the term form of life, we understand a life that can never be separated from its form, a life in which it is never possible to isolate and keep distinct something like a bare life. So here, form and life are inseparable. And this is, to link it with some of the earlier talks, it sounds as if Agamben is talking about a kind of lost plenitude, right? The dream, the fantasy of a life that would no longer be structured through alienation or lack, right? And there's something to that, but it's worth holding on to that fantasy, right? Or to play with that fantasy and think about what's at stake in this kind of high stakes fantasy. Because it's not just the inseparability of life and form. Form of life is also the separability of life and language. That's the key. So this isn't alienation, but there's a line to be drawn, not between life and form, but between life and language. Agamben writes, the mystery of the human being is not the metaphysical one of the conjunction between the living being and language, or reason or soul, but the practical and political one of their separation. And Agamben actually goes on to say that this is what he means by the term anthropogenesis. The becoming human of the human animal happens not with the discovery of language, but with the separation, the break away from language. It's actually the moment when language is inoperative. We render language inoperative in art, in aesthetics, in ethics. That's the moment that he says always and everywhere is the instance of the political. The sort of the genuine political, let's say, is the moment when we separate from language, which is, it seems a very strange claim. That's what he says, right? But that it's not what you would expect, right? So on the one hand, there's the inseparability of life and form, the separability of life and language. And then he uses this term form of life to kind of up the stakes. He sees this as a kind of resolution of the impasse of Western sovereignty. He talks about, he said it's necessary to neutralize the bipolar Zoe bios apparatus. And the only way we can do this is that in a way that form of life can appear as the tertium, the third that will become thinkable starting from the inoperativity of the difference. So again, kind of echoing that claim by Foucault here, rather than truth, we have form of life as this third that in some sense overcomes the break between bios and Zoe, right? So it seems to have this kind of synthetic promise. He talks about a kind of unity of immanence and transcendence. It's both a life inseparable from its form, but it's also separable from everything and every creature. So, and you again here, the Franciscans become a wonderful image of this. What was it to live as a Franciscan friar? You were one with all things, but by being totally indifferent to all things, right? You talked to the animals, you walked around barefoot, but it's because you didn't care, right? So it's to be utterly at one with one's life, in such a way that you are always in principle separable from any particular context. And then finally, he talks about this as an ontological category. He says, the problem with form of life is it's always been understood ethically as something like a group identity, something like a common tribal ethos, or aesthetically in terms of style. And he says that's the problem in the West is form of life has been thought in terms of ethics and aesthetics, when in fact it's a matter of ontology. And he goes there to Spinoza. He says what we need to think is how can the many modes be modes of one and the same substance. So I'm thinking mode here as being like a manner or a style, but at the ontological level, not at an ethical or aesthetic level. So that I think gives us some basis for at least posing what seems to me a pretty clear question to Agamben. I don't really claim to have the answer to this, and I don't think Agamben has the answer, but I think it's an interesting, now well-posed problem, which is how is the separation of the living being and language, which is what Agamben is calling for, different from the exclusion of bare life from the sovereign political order, right? If anything Agamben is saying is going to make sense, there has to be some important difference between the separation of life and language on the one hand, and the exclusion of bare life by the political order on the other. But that it doesn't seem to me clear. Like, I mean, I'm not saying that it's not, that it's in a contradiction or something, but I just don't, I think it's an open question. What is this difference? And that's why I think, on the one hand, we get a clear suggestion from Agamben that we should see this difference in the form of life of the Franciscan order, that somehow the Franciscans found a way to do this, that they separated the living being and in this case, the monastic rule. They didn't treat the rule as a law. It was not even really a rule of in an ordinary monastic sense, it was understood that chastity, obedience, and poverty just were the ways that they lived. And there's a wonderful point where Francis is kind of pushed by some people. Well, what if some of your, so-called friars are out like cavorting or doing these things? It's like, I don't care. Like then they're just not living the life, right? It's not to say they failed to follow the rule. That's just they just aren't living this way. There's nothing more to be said. And so there's a distinction between the rule of life, the regula vitae, and the regula juris, the rule of law. I think there's a lot to be said about this role of the Franciscan order, but I'm particularly drawn as a philosopher to some of the hints that Agamben makes here and there that there are also concepts in Wittgenstein that could make sense of this notion of form 11. Of course, Lebensform is a very important concept in Wittgenstein, but Agamben doesn't use Wittgenstein very much. It's kind of surprising how seldom he actually cites Wittgenstein on this. But at one point in the Use of Bodies, he does talk about the notion of a constitutive norm as he's trying to develop the notion of form of life. He says, well, Wittgenstein had a nice notion of a constitutive norm, which is different from a rule in the ordinary sense. And the example given by Wittgenstein kind of canonically is the movement of a chess piece. What is a pawn? A pawn in chess just is the rules of how it can move, right? One square forward at a time, capturing diagonally, right? So it's not as if there's a pawn and then you somehow make it subsumed to some sort of rule. The pawn just is the rules that constitute it as such. So this seems to be another image that would kind of triangulate with the notion of the Franciscan form of life. And that's why I think that this work that Kripke has done on Wittgenstein might be useful for thinking about Agamben. Basically, what Kripke wants to do is push the radicality of Wittgenstein's notion of skepticism with respect to rule following. So Wittgenstein introduces the idea that there just isn't a fact of the matter with respect to which someone has a rule that they are following, in the sense that there's no fact of the matter as someone is counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that the next term that they will say is 6. It might be the case that they will say 6, and it might be the case that they say it 100 times out of 100, but there's no fact of the matter in advance of saying 6 that establishes that 6 will be the next term in the sequence. And what Kripke wants to emphasize is that this is such a radical skepticism that actually it calls into question any meaning whatsoever, because for Wittgenstein, meaning just is being capable of following a certain rule of practice. And so he really wants to push the notion of the skepticism about rule following all the way to the base, so that it becomes a skepticism about any possibility for meaning whatsoever. As Kripke says, he says, how can we show any language at all, public, private, what have you, to even be possible? It's not that calling a sensation pain is easy, and then Wittgenstein has to invent a difficulty, namely, how do I distinguish my pain from your? How do I attribute pain to you? Right? It's not like oh, it's easy for me to say this is pain, but it's hard to attribute it to another person. It's just the meaning pain for anyone, even for me, seems to be off the table. So we have this very radical skepticism, and then Kripke introduces a distinction between what he calls a straight solution and a skeptical solution to a skeptical argument in philosophy. And the kind of canonical instance of a straight solution to skepticism would be someone like Descartes. So you have the problem of radical doubt, radical skepticism in Descartes, and then Descartes overcomes the skepticism by finding some kind of leverage. He's like, actually, we don't have to be skeptical because there is, that which cannot be doubted, namely my act of thinking at the moment that I'm thinking it, right? So that would be a straight solution. You sort of beat the skepticism. But there's then also a skeptical solution, which the paradigm here would be Hume, that Hume on causality, there's this worry, how do we have a necessary connection between two events, right? We're threatened by skepticism about cause. Hume gives into the skepticism. He says there's no way to beat it, but he does have a solution, which is custom, right? So notice that there's this kind of pragmatic twist. Hume doesn't negate the skeptical claim, but he says, actually, the problem was finding the skeptical situation difficult or problematic at all, because in actual fact, we can live with it. So a skeptical solution to skepticism is seeing why the skepticism isn't such a bad thing after all. And so what Kripke wants to do is delineate Wittgenstein's skeptical solution to the rule following problem. Basically, to cite Kripke here, just in a nutshell, obviously the analysis is pretty thorny and interesting, but at the end of the day, in Kripke's words, Wittgenstein replaces the question, what must be the case for this sentence to be true, by two others. First, under what conditions may this form of words be appropriately asserted or denied? Second, given an answer to this first question, what is the role and the utility in our lives of our practice of asserting or denying the form of words under these conditions? In other words, instead of asking the question about meaning or truth, what are truth conditions or meaning conditions of an assertion, we just ask for pragmatic conditions of assertability. Under what conditions is it appropriate for me to say snow is white? It's not a question of linking my claim true as white to a state of affairs, right? It's just saying, under the conditions of you and me being in the presence of white snow, it is appropriate for me to say, right? Which is, it seems as if not, you're just moving the bump in the rug, but it makes a big difference to say that what defines the rightness of my speech is not a condition of what is out there, but a condition of intersubjective discourse, right? Some condition of my assertability of the claim that is not necessarily dependent on how things are kind of in the world. And then more importantly, secondly, once we can think of things in terms of assertability conditions, the question ultimately comes down to what function do those assertability conditions actually play in our lives? So the bottom, the foundational question for Wittgenstein, according to Kripke, is what use do we make of being able to say such and such? And there are basically two interesting consequences follow from this way of thinking. The first is that if we think in terms of assertability conditions, we get a radical break between individual language and collective language. And this is the main kind of argument that Kripke makes, is that the private language argument of Wittgenstein, that a single person cannot have a language, Kripke sees as a consequence of the rule following argument. It's like a corollary. In other words, if rule following works through this kind of radical skepticism, then it follows as a deductive consequence that one person alone cannot have a language. Why? Because no determination exists for what they're going to do next, so they could just say anything. So then the skepticism really exists. There just is no meaning. There's no meaning for an individual because there's no rule that they're following. But as soon as you move to the collective context, you have an answer to the assertability condition question. Namely, if I say something crazy, someone is going to walk up and say, you said something crazy. It doesn't mean that I'm wrong. It just means that we now have constraint, which is a purely political constraint organized around something like consensus or agreement. Right? So that's the first, and that's the thing that Kripke focuses on, really, is this way that we get out of skepticism by finding a kind of radical situatedness within social conditions. It's not facts of the matter about the world that determine our truth. It's facts about what people are going to say in a given social group with respect to various assertions. And then the second consequence, which I think is also interesting for thinking about Agamben, is that Kripke points out that when you think this way in terms of assertability conditions, you end up with what he calls a kind of inversion of the conditional framework of reasoning. So in terms of just good classical logic, P implies Q is exactly the same, the logically equivalent to not Q implies not P, right? They're one and the same logical form. But Kripke says, yeah, but they have a kind of different emphasis. And he uses the notion of causality here from Hume to kind of get a sense of this. Normally, we think, if we say, striking a match causes a flame, we think of it, we see that like implication, and we somehow think that there's something in the striking that leads to the flame, right? So we sort of implicitly think of it as being a kind of power. So the logical conditional P implies Q puts kind of the ontological onus on the P. The P is sort of where the power resides so as to generate Q. Whereas if you take the contrapositive, not Q implies not P, you think of basically things that you can do that break away or cut off the possibility. It's as if then the power is there, the negational power is there with the consequent. And so he, in terms of Wittgenstein, he says that this is a way, rather than saying, I know what the word plus means. That's why I'll tell you that 25 plus 5 equals 30. You end up turning around and say, well, if I tell you that 25 plus 5 is 31, you're going to say, I don't know what plus means. Again, logically, it's the same thing, but it shifts the focus. It's saying the conditions, what do I have to do to show you that I don't know the meaning or the rule, rather than presuming that the rule is what is going to kind of churn out the right answer. So that to kind of bring this back to Agamben and sort of wrap it up, I think it's these two consequences of the skeptical argument that actually I think might shed some light on Agamben's notion of form of life. On the one hand, the distinction in Wittgenstein between individual rule following and collective rule following, it seems to me that this corresponds in some sense to the fullness and inalienability of potentiality in Agamben's notion of form of life. That what Agamben, at least what Agamben wants, whether it's really there for the taking is another question, but what Agamben wants from form of life is a way for communities to regulate themselves without falling under the form of a law. And how is such a thing possible? It seems like such a thing would be possible if the only thing that held the community together were its agreement. Right? If there was a thinness to that level of agreement, so the agreement was nothing but agreement about that agreement. So there would be, and it would suggest why an individual would lack the form of life. They would have their life, but as soon as it becomes a form of life, it would become something like a Franciscan pattern, Franciscan mode. Right. There's no rationality. There's no convergence on a state of affairs. There's only, as it happens, what it is that we do as the community that makes the community what it is. Which I mean, and it's also not entirely appealing. If you think like, if that's what Agamben really wants from form of life, it's really hard to distinguish it from a certain kind of like thin fascism. Yeah. But again, I mean, maybe thin fascism is not a bad thing, right? Just because it's a bad word, right? And that's Agamben is certainly working in that space where it's very close to being a very dangerous ideological construction, but he's committed to a kind of Heideggerian, where the danger is the saving power lies also kind of logic. I think that's definitely somewhere there, and this would be a place maybe where you could locate that concretely. That the kind of collectivity in the form of life is found in this thin line between the danger and the potential. But then I think what, at least for me, kind of more appealing proposal, it has to do with this notion of the conditional inversion, because I think that that's actually something that you could work with if we took Kripke's suggestion. Again, the contrapositive is a different emphasis than the ordinary conditional. That might be an interesting way to think about the problem of sovereignty. Rather than saying sovereignty implies the exclusion of bare life, you could turn it around and say something like, the refusal to exclude bare life will challenge the construction of any sovereign political order, right? From a logical point of view, it's exactly the same thing, but suddenly the agency is on the negative activity of refusing to exclude bare life, right? And that might align Agamben more closely with people like Pierre Clastres. There's a wonderful book, Society Against the State, with the logic of basically traditional like tribal organizations, according to Clastres, are aware of the state. They know that the state, they just fear it, and they do everything in their power to structure things so that the state won't happen. So in other words, that centralized authority cannot form, right? And so this idea that the state or sovereignty is always hovering as a possibility, and the work of kind of political order is to push off the sovereign, push away the formation of the state. That might be an interesting way to, for one thing, I think to step away from what can, at least in earlier Agamben, sound like a kind of hopelessness, that there doesn't seem to be a way out. That again, that would put more agency on the resistance. That's, yeah, thanks. And again, it's wonderful to be part of this whole thing. Yeah.
Mike. Thanks, Rocky Gangle, for really putting an interesting twist using Kripke onto Agamben after you identified that interesting problematic earlier. Yeah, that's incredible. Did you come up with that, or? I mean, no. How did you came up with that on the plane over? I get it. That's pretty good. Okay, thank you. We can. Well, I see Peter Rollins and Chaz Snyder have joined us. Thanks for coming in. And remind me of your name. Micah. Right, Micah from Manchester. Yeah. Son of Derek. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Great. And so I think that concludes our symposium. Although it would be really fun. This is just me indulging. It's just have just a conversation going right now, but I think we can try to pick that up some other time. But thanks for watching online with us. Appreciate it. We've had over 70 folks are on now, so that's great. And thanks a lot. That's it. Barry, you want to say anything in conclusion, or anybody want to? Okay, maybe we can have Pete. Maybe we can have Pete say something about Wake again, just for everybody who's watching.
What was I going to say?
Just anything, what's going on here in Belfast?
Oh yeah, this is very exciting for me. Oh yeah. So thank you guys. Thank you. Hello everybody. This is my dream for Belfast whenever I lived here, was to make this a real center for these kinds of debates and discussions, philosophy, life, psychoanalysis, theology. And so the idea that Wake is happening 30 seconds from here, you guys are having the symposium. There's a lot of similarities in terms of the discussions about desire, satisfaction. This is kind of fantastic. So I'm very, very happy to have you guys here. And hopefully you're maybe going to live stream or record some of the wake stuff, maybe, or we can give some of that to GCAS to use. So perfect. There you go. Thank you.
It's really great. And yeah, we'd like to thank Todd McGowan for joining us, and Jim Olthuis. Pete, thank you. And the contributors, Alfie and Helen, Rocco, Barry. Thanks so much, Manuel, for helping out, and Maria. Okay, so I think that's it. And thanks, and stay tuned for more stuff going on tomorrow with Barry's seminar in the morning and Jameson Webster tomorrow night. Thanks a lot. And